Ilara became a widow in the season of dust. It was a time when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind was a thief, stealing the moisture from the soil, from the cracked lips of the people, from the very memory of rain. Her husband, David, a man who read stories in stone and sermons in sediment, had been taken by the one thing he trusted most: the earth itself. A rockslide, they called it, a geological inevitability. To Ilara, it was a quiet, final betrayal, a closing of a book in the middle of a sentence. He left behind a small collection of well-worn flannel shirts that still smelled of pine and dust, a stack of notebooks filled with his elegant sloping script, and a sum of money so meager it felt more like an apology than an inheritance. She was 29 years old, and the world had suddenly become a vast, shelterless plain. The life they had built together in the small university town was dismantled piece by piece. First, the rented house, its rooms echoing with conversations that would never be finished. Then the furniture, sold for cents on the dollar to strangers who saw only wood and fabric, not the geography of a shared existence. She sold his truck, his tools, even most of his books, keeping only the leather-bound notebooks that held the cartography of his mind. Each transaction was a small death, an erasure. She moved through the process with a hollowed-out efficiency that was often mistaken for strength. In reality, it was the armor of grief, a numbness so profound it mimicked purpose. The world had become a series of practical problems to be solved, because to stop and feel the entirety of her loss was to risk being swept away by it, like a lone figure in a flash flood. The town of Covenant was not a destination. It was a place people ended up. It clung to the edge of the high plains like a stubborn burr on a wool blanket. A small knot of clapboard buildings and dusty streets huddled against the immense, indifferent expanse of the sky. It was here, in the land office run by a man named Mr. Thornton, that Ilara's practical desperation led her. Thornton was a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, which were small, dark beads that seemed to be perpetually calculating sums. He appraised her the way he appraised land, noting the worn state of her dress, the fatigue etched around her eyes, and the thinness of her purse, which she held as if it were the last anchor in a storm. "I have a parcel," he had said, his voice a low, confidential hum. He unrolled a map, the paper crackling like dry leaves. "It is not for everyone." He traced a finger over a blotch of ink far from the thin blue line of the river and the small squares that marked other homesteads. 200 acres. No, well, I must be honest, and it is bisected by a rather significant feature. He called it the Serpentine Arroyo, a name far too elegant for the jagged, sun-baked scar it represented on the land. People called it the Devil's Gulch. It was a place of bad soil, worse luck, and no water. It was land that had been for sale for a generation, a running joke in the county. Ilara looked at the map, but she was seeing something else. She was seeing the last of her money, a tangible weight in her pocket that was dwindling with every meal, every night spent in a boarding house. She saw the pity in Mr. Thornton's eyes, the predatory gleam that understood her lack of options. He was offering her a place to fail in private. He was selling her the horizon itself, a patch of emptiness where she could disappear. "I will take it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The words surprised even her. Thornton's smile finally touched his eyes, not with warmth but with the flat, dead satisfaction of a successful transaction. He had just sold a ghost a place to be haunted. The news traveled through Covenant with the speed of gossip, which was faster than wind and more persistent than drought. The geologist's widow, the one with the haunted eyes, had bought the Devil's Gulch. It was not seen as an act of hope, but as the final, tragic chapter of a sad story. It was what grief did to a person. They murmured over coffee at the Mercantile. It scoured the sense right out of you. They pictured her out there, a fragile silhouette against the crushing emptiness, slowly being worn down by the sun and the silence. Her purchase was not a beginning, but an end. She had bought her own grave, and the whole town was there to witness the digging. For the first month, Ilara did nothing but walk. She did not unpack the few crates she had paid a farmer to haul out for her. She did not pitch her tent in one place for more than a night. She walked the perimeter of her 200 acres, her boots kicking up puffs of ochre dust. She learned the land not as a proprietor, but as a student. She carried one of David's notebooks, its pages filled with his observations on thermal dynamics, on the ancient wisdom of cliff dwellers, on the subtle language of erosion. She walked in the pre-dawn chill when the air was thin and sharp, and she walked in the brutal, hammering heat of midday when the world shimmered and distorted. She learned the personalities of the wind. The morning breeze was a gentle whisper that carried the scent of sage and dry earth. The afternoon wind was a bully, a relentless force that pushed and pulled, seeking to unbalance her. The evening wind was a lament, a long, low sigh that seemed to carry the loneliness of the entire prairie. The land was a study in hostility. The ground was baked hard as ceramic, crisscrossed with fissures. The few plants that survived were armored with thorns and spines. It was a place that did not welcome softness. It demanded hardness in return. Her focus, always, was the arroyo. It was a brutal gash in the earth, 20 feet deep in places, its walls carved by the memory of water. It was a place of shadows and stark light. To stand on the rim was to feel a kind of vertigo, to look down into a wound. The people of Covenant saw it as a threat, a conduit for the flash floods that were the dark twin of the region's droughts. It was a place to be avoided, a channel for destruction. But Ilara, walking the dusty floor of the gulch, began to feel something different. Down here, the world changed. The bully wind that raked the plains above was tamed into a gentle, swirling current. The sun, a merciless eye in the open sky, could only strike the floor for a few hours at midday. The rest of the time, the high earthen walls cast long, cool shadows. She would press her hand against the western wall of the arroyo in the late afternoon and feel a deep, resonant coolness. In the chill of the morning, that same wall radiated a faint, stored warmth. The earth itself was a battery, storing and releasing the energy of the day. It was a lung, breathing in the cool of the night and exhaling it slowly against the heat of the day. One evening, sitting with her back against the cool clay wall, she opened David's notebook. Her fingers traced his familiar script. He had not been writing about this specific place, but about principles as old as the rocks themselves. The ancestral Puebloans did not build against the cliffs, he had written. They built within them. They understood that the greatest shelter is not a wall you build, but a hollow you inhabit. They did not fight the environment. They negotiated with it. He wrote of thermal mass, of how a sufficient thickness of earth could smooth out the most violent temperature swings, creating a stable, livable equilibrium. He wrote of hydrology, not as a force of destruction, but as a force of creation, the sculptor of canyons and the giver of life. The idea did not arrive like a lightning strike. It seeped into her, a slow, quiet infiltration, like rain into parched soil. Everyone in Covenant looked at the arroyo and saw a flood zone, a place of danger, a mistake. She looked at it and saw a foundation that was already dug. She saw walls that were already built. She saw a shield against the wind and a parasol against the sun. They saw a channel for a flood. She saw a channel for life. The conventional wisdom was to build on high ground, to stand above the fray, to fight the land's tendencies. Her plan, forming slowly in the crucible of her grief and David's wisdom, was to do the opposite. She would not build on high ground. She would not build near the arroyo. She would build inside it. She would burrow into the western wall, yielding to the landscape, and in that yielding find her strength. She would disappear. Her plan was an act of quiet rebellion. It was a refutation of every piece of common sense the world had to offer. She would carve her home from the wall of the arroyo, a human burrow, a place of earth and shadow. The front would be a single wall of salvaged wood and glass, facing east to catch the gentle morning sun. The other 3 walls, and the roof, would be the earth itself, tons of it, a perfect insulator gifted to her by the landscape. And she would not try to stop the water. That was the folly of men who thought they could command the world. Instead, she would gentle it. Further up the arroyo, she would build a series of small check dams, not impenetrable walls, but porous sieves of rock and earth. They would not halt a flood. They would slow it, spread it, rob it of its fury. They would encourage it to drop its precious cargo of silt and to seep deep into the ground, recharging the hidden aquifers. Her home would not be a fortress against nature, but a partnership with it. She bought the tools in covenant. An old pickaxe with a handle worn smooth by another man's sweat, a shovel with a blade sharpened down by years of use, a wheelbarrow with a wobbly, complaining wheel. The store owner, a man named Henderson, watched her load the tools into a borrowed cart. He had the same look of sorrowful pity as everyone else. A woman alone has no business with such things, his eyes seemed to say. She met his gaze without flinching, paid in coin, and left. The weight of the tools was reassuring. They were simple, honest things. They did not offer pity. They offered only the promise of work. The work began. The sound of her pickaxe striking the hard-packed caliche of the arroyo wall became the new rhythm of her days. It was a sharp, percussive report that echoed in the enclosed space, a conversation between her intention and the earth's resistance. At first, the progress was agonizingly slow. She would swing the heavy tool until her shoulders burned and her arms trembled with exhaustion, only to have dislodged a few handfuls of stubborn soil and rock. Her hands, soft from a life of books and indoor tasks, blistered within the first hour. By the end of the day, the blisters had broken, leaving raw, weeping skin. She cleaned them with whiskey from a small flask, the sting a sharp reminder of her own vulnerability, and wrapped them in strips of cloth. She lived in a canvas tent pitched on the arroyo floor, a temporary creature in a permanent landscape. Every morning she rose before the sun, ate a simple meal of oats and dried fruit, and began to dig. Every evening, as the shadows grew long and the canyon filled with a soft purple light, she would stop, her body a single unified ache. She would heat water over a small fire and wash the dust from her skin. Some nights she was too tired to eat, falling into a heavy, dreamless sleep on her cot, the ghost ache of the pickaxe still echoing in her muscles. The blisters on her hands healed, and in their place grew a new layer of skin, thick and tough. The calluses were a testament, a physical record of her persistence. They were the first part of her that adapted to this new life. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The small indentation in the arroyo wall grew. It became a cave, then a room. She learned the language of the soil. A layer of soft clay gave way to a stratum of gravel, which in turn rested on a shelf of sandstone. Each layer required a different approach, a different tool, a different kind of effort. She was not merely digging a hole. She was performing a kind of terrestrial surgery, carefully excavating a space for herself within the body of the earth. The pile of excavated dirt grew into a small mountain beside her tent, a testament to the thousands of wheelbarrow trips she had made, her complaining wheel squeaking out its own song of labor. It was during this time that Silas first saw her. He was a rancher whose land bordered her own, a man as weathered and unadorned as the landscape itself. He rode a tall roan horse and sat in the saddle with the easy grace of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on his own 2 feet. He reined in his horse at the rim of the arroyo, his hat tipped low against the sun. He watched her for a long time, a small, solitary figure wrestling with the earth. He saw the shovel, the pickaxe, the growing hollow in the wall. To his practical, experienced eyes, it looked like madness. It looked like a woman digging her own tomb. He navigated his horse down a shallow break in the arroyo wall and approached her. She stopped working, leaning on her shovel, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat. She was breathing heavily, but her eyes were clear and direct. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He removed his hat, a gesture of ingrained politeness. "It is not my place to say, but this is no place to be digging. The first rule of this land is, you build on high ground. You do not invite the water in." He was not being unkind. He was offering the collected wisdom of generations, a truth forged in the harsh reality of flood and ruin. "Thank you for your concern, mister," she replied, her voice steady. "Silas," he said. "Just Silas." "Mr. Silas," she said with a small nod. "I have considered the water." She offered no further explanation. She simply turned back to her work, driving the shovel into the loose earth at her feet. The gesture was not rude, it was final. It was the quiet, unarguable statement of a woman who had made her decision. Silas sat on his horse for another moment, a frown creasing his sun-tanned face. He saw not madness now, but a kind of terrifying, single-minded purpose. He put his hat back on, turned his horse, and rode away, shaking his head. The story he told in town wasn't one of mockery, but of bafflement. "She is digging," he said to the men at the feed store. "And I do not think a thing on this earth could make her stop." Mr. Thornton's visit was of a different character entirely. He arrived in a polished black buggy, a vehicle of profound absurdity in the rugged landscape. He had come not out of concern, but out of a morbid proprietary curiosity. He expected to find Alara defeated, perhaps already gone, the land ready to be reclaimed and resold. He walked to the edge of the arroyo, his town shoes crunching on the dry gravel, and looked down. What he saw made him laugh. It was a loud, braying sound that echoed off the canyon walls, a sound of pure, unadulterated ridicule. "A mole woman," he shouted down at her, his hands on his hips. By God, Silas was right. "You are digging to China." He found the sight of her, covered in dust, toiling in her self-made hole, to be the most amusing thing he had ever witnessed. You know what happens in these gulches when the rain comes, don't you? It scours them clean. It takes everything. You will be the first to drown, buried in your own mad little hole. Alara did not look up. She did not pause in her work. She simply continued to fill the wheelbarrow, her movements rhythmic and deliberate. Her silence, her complete refusal to acknowledge him, was more infuriating to Thornton than any angry retort could have been. He was a man who fed on the reactions of others: fear, deference, respect. Her indifference starved him. He shouted a few more insults, his voice growing shrill, but the words were swallowed by the vast, uncaring space. He eventually left, fuming, and drove his ridiculous buggy back to town. The story he told was laced with malice. He painted a picture of a crazed woman, driven mad by grief, living in a dirt hole like an animal. The Covenant madwoman now had a new name: the Mole Woman. It stuck. The name was a perfect encapsulation of the town's judgment. She was something strange, something subterranean and unnatural, something to be pitied and scorned. Children from the town would sometimes ride their ponies out to the edge of the arroyo, daring each other to get a glimpse of the Mole Woman's hole, before galloping away, filled with a delicious manufactured terror. The community chorus had found its key, and it was a song of mockery. Alara heard them sometimes, their high, childish shrieks carried on the wind, but it was just another sound in the landscape, no more meaningful than the cry of a hawk or the chatter of cicadas. Her world had shrunk to the space between the arroyo walls, to the feel of the pickaxe in her hands, to the slow, satisfying transformation of the earth. By the time the first winter approached, the excavation was complete. The space was larger than it looked from the outside. A main living area, a small sleeping alcove, and a root cellar dug deeper into the cool earth. She had bartered for old timbers in a town 30 miles away, trading the last of her husband's geological survey maps, which were of great value to a mining prospector she happened to meet. She framed the single, east-facing wall, leaving openings for a door and 2 windows she had salvaged from a collapsed homestead. The work was slow and painstaking. She had no block and tackle, only leverage and patience. She learned to use the earth as her partner, building ramps of dirt to slide the heavy beams into place. The first of her check dams was built a quarter-mile upstream. It was an unassuming structure, a low, wide crescent of rocks and packed earth, no more than 3 feet high. It looked flimsy, temporary. To an uninformed eye, it was a laughable defense against a real flood. But Ilara was not building a wall. She was building a filter. She had spent days observing the flow of pebbles and sand during a small, brief shower, noting the eddies and currents. The dam was placed precisely where the arroyo began to narrow, designed to force the water to slow and spread, to drop its energy. Silas saw the dam on one of his rides. It was late autumn, and the air had a new, sharp bite to it. He had been keeping his distance, but his curiosity was a persistent itch. He had seen the smoke from her stovepipe and knew she had moved into her subterranean home. He looked at the low wall of rocks. It did not seem like much. But then he noticed other things. He noticed how the wind, which was cutting across the plains with a bitter edge, was almost non-existent down where she worked. He saw the neat stack of firewood beside her door, the glint of glass in her windows. This was not the camp of a transient madwoman. It was the homestead of a settler. As he turned to leave, he saw a bucket near her door, empty. He rode back to his own ranch, filled a large canteen with fresh, sweet water from his well, and rode back. He left it on a flat rock near the path down into the arroyo. He did not call out to her. It was a small, silent gesture, an offering of respect for a stubbornness he was beginning to see not as madness, but as a form of faith. When he rode by a week later, the empty canteen was sitting on the rock, waiting for him. A silent communication had begun. 2 years passed. 2 cycles of blistering summer and frigid winter. Ilara's existence settled into a quiet rhythm dictated by the seasons. Her home was a marvel of comfort. In the summer, when the temperature on the plains soared past 100 degrees, her earthen walls kept the interior a steady, cool 70. In the winter, when blizzards buried the prairie in snow and the wind howled like a hungry wolf, a small fire in her cast-iron stove was enough to keep the space warm and snug. The earth was her blanket. She had built 2 more check dams upstream, each one a little more sophisticated than the last. She had dug a channel to divert a portion of any water flow into a stone-lined cistern she had built near her cabin. Her garden, planted in the rich silt that had begun to accumulate behind her dams, produced a small but steady supply of vegetables. She had, against all logic and expectation, begun to thrive. The drought of the 3rd year was the worst in living memory. The sun was a white-hot coin in a bleached sky. The earth cracked open in a mosaic of thirst. Rivers shrank to muddy trickles, and wells in Covenant began to run dry. The ranchers, like Silas, sold off their cattle for pennies on the dollar, their faces grim masks of dust and worry. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something had to break. The sky remained stubbornly, cruelly blue for months. Then, in late August, the color began to change. The blue deepened to a bruised purple-gray on the horizon. The air grew heavy, thick, and still. The birds fell silent. Silas, mending a fence, stopped and looked at the sky, sniffing the air. He tasted ozone and dread. He had seen a sky like this only once before, in his childhood. A sky that promised not relief but wrath. In Covenant, the mood was a strange mix of hope and fear. They prayed for rain, but they feared the rain that this sky promised. Mr. Thornton stood on the porch of his bank, watching the ominous clouds gather. A customer mentioned the Arroyo woman. Thornton scoffed, his good humor restored by the impending drama. "Well, the mole woman will be getting a bath tonight," he said, and the men around him chuckled nervously. He imagined the first torrent of water hitting that ridiculous hole in the ground, a satisfying, final erasure of the woman who had so thoroughly ignored him. The thought pleased him. It was the universe restoring order. The storm broke just after dusk. It began with a low, distant rumble, a clearing of the sky's throat. Then came the lightning, not in flickering bolts, but in great silent sheets that lit up the entire prairie in stark, ghostly tableaus. And then the rain. It was not a sound of individual drops, but a single deafening roar, as if the sky itself were a waterfall. It was a vertical flood. The ground, baked into a waterproof shell by the drought, could not absorb it. The water began to move, first in shimmering sheets across the plains, then in rivulets, then in roaring, muddy streams, all of it seeking the lowest ground, all of it funneling towards the hungry mouth of the serpentine arroyo. For Silas, the night was a frantic battle against the rising water. The creek near his barn, normally a placid ribbon of green, became a brown, churning monster. It tore at the barn's foundation and ripped out 100 yards of his best fence. He worked by lantern light, his body soaked and shivering, moving his remaining livestock to the highest point of his land, his heart a cold knot of anxiety. In Covenant, the lower end of Main Street was under a foot of water. It poured into basements, ruining stored goods and turning cellars into murky, stinking pools. Mr. Thornton's bank was hit the worst. The water found its way into his cellar, where years of records, deeds, and loan documents were stored in cardboard boxes. The ink bled, the paper turned to pulp. His carefully constructed world was dissolving in the mud. But in the arroyo, a different story was unfolding. Alara sat at her small wooden table, a mug of warm tea in her hands, and listened. The roar of the storm was a distant, muted thing, the fury of the wind a song sung in a faraway room. She felt the vibration of the coming water through the floor long before she heard it, a deep thrumming in the bones of the earth. Then came the sound, a low rumble that grew into the roar of a freight train. It was not a sound of terror. It was the sound of her design coming to life. The first wave of the flash flood, a wall of brown water carrying debris from the plains, slammed into her highest check dam. The structure groaned but held. The water, its momentum broken, was forced to spread out, its energy dissipating across the width of the arroyo. It dropped a heavy load of sediment and debris, then poured over the top of the dam, diminished. It hit the second dam, and the process was repeated. It slowed further, dropped more silt. By the time the main flow of the flood reached the section of the arroyo where her home was, it was no longer a destructive, scouring torrent. It was a deep, powerful, but orderly river. It flowed with a controlled force down the central channel she had kept clear. The water level rose, climbing the banks, until it was flowing past her front door, mere feet away, but it did not touch it. The small channel she had dug to her cistern worked perfectly, diverting a steady stream of water that was filtered through layers of sand and gravel, filling her reservoir with 1,000 gallons of clean, life-giving water. She was an island of perfect calm in the heart of the tempest, warm, dry, and safe, listening to the symphony of her own vindication. The rain stopped just before dawn. An exhausted, battered world emerged under a sky washed clean. Silas, his face gray with fatigue, had saved his animals, but his property was a wreck. A deep, paternalistic worry, an emotion he had long refused to acknowledge, gnawed at him. He had to see. He saddled his horse and rode toward the arroyo, his heart heavy, expecting the worst. He expected to see a place scoured clean by God's own fury, the mad woman and her hole simply gone, erased. He reached the rim and looked down. He blinked, certain his tired eyes were deceiving him. The floor of the arroyo was a sheet of dark, rich mud, but it was not a scene of destruction. And there, nestled into the western wall, was the cabin. It was utterly untouched. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stovepipe, a steady, placid signal of life. As he watched, the door opened, and Alara stepped out. She wore a simple dress and a shawl. She walked calmly to the edge of her cistern, checked its level, and then looked up at the sky, a small, serene smile on her face. Silas could not contain himself. He felt a crack in the foundation of everything he thought he knew about the world, about survival, about this land. He urged his horse down the treacherous path. "How?" he called out, his voice a hoarse croak of disbelief. He gestured at the cabin, the placid scene, the impossible survival. "How are you not washed away?" Alara looked at him, her expression one of quiet patience. "I did not fight it, Mr. Silas," she said, her voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "I listened to it. The deal was done." Silas was a man of few words, but the story he told was powerful. He did not describe it in terms of engineering or hydrology. He spoke of it as a kind of miracle. He told of the destruction on his own land, the chaos in the town, and then he described the impossible calm at the bottom of the Devil's Gulch. He told them about the smoke rising from the chimney. People came. At first it was just a few curious ranchers, then families from the town in their wagons. They stood in a silent line along the rim of the arroyo, like spectators at a strange theater, looking down at Alara's home. They saw the dark, wet earth, the full cistern, the intact garden, and the woman herself, moving about her chores with a calm that felt like a judgment on their own frantic survival. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a stunned, grudging awe. Mr. Thornton never came. The flood had ruined him. The pulpy, illegible remains of his records were a symbol of his own dissolved authority. He had built his world on paper, on the high ground of finance and social standing, and a simple thing like water had washed it all away. He could not face the woman he had named the Mole Woman, the woman who had built her foundation on the earth itself and had endured. He sold his bankrupt bank for a pittance and left Covenant in his absurdly polished buggy, disappearing over the horizon. The shift in perception was seismic. She was no longer the Covenant madwoman. Some began to call her the Arroyo Woman. Others, more simply, referred to her home and her methods as Alara's way. They came to her not with pity, but with questions. Silas was the first. He asked her to walk his land with him, to show him where to build dams, how to work with the flow of the water, not against it. Others followed. They came with their hats in their hands, the same people who had whispered and laughed, and they asked for her knowledge. She shared it freely, speaking in the simple, direct language of the earth she understood so well. She taught them to see the land not as an adversary, but as a partner. She taught them to listen. Decades passed. The landscape around Covenant began to change. More homes were built low to the ground, nestled into hillsides and sheltered by the contours of the land. Small, clever check dams appeared in dry creek beds, turning destructive floods into life-giving events. The Arroyo method became the new conventional wisdom, a piece of local knowledge passed down from parents to children, its origins blurring into legend. They said a wise woman had come to the valley long ago, a woman who had learned the secrets of the earth. Alara lived out her days in the quiet security she had carved for herself. She never sought fame or recognition. Her triumph was not in the admiration of others, but in the deep peace of her own existence. She had disappeared, just as the townspeople had predicted, but not into madness or death. She had disappeared into a perfect harmony with her world, becoming so much a part of the landscape that it was difficult to tell where the earth ended and she began. Her life was a testament, a quiet but enduring story written in stone and soil. The story of Alara of the Arroyo is more than a tale of survival. It is a lesson in perception. It reminds us that the most valuable knowledge is often quiet, residing not in the shouts of the crowd, but in the whispers of the overlooked. It teaches that the greatest strength is not found in resistance, but in accommodation, and that true security is not a wall built against the world, but a foundation deeply connected to it. It is the story of the courage it takes to look foolish, the patience required to do the slow, necessary work, and the profound wisdom of finding the potential hidden in all the places that have been declared worthless. It is a reminder that sometimes the only way to find your place in the world is to dig.